Out on the endless frontier, where the wind carries dust and secrets alike, every story begins with a whisper and ends with a scar. These are not the legends written in books, but the tales traded by firelight and silence of men who stood alone, of women who carried storms inside them, of choices carved into the desert itself. Tonight, you will ride with me into one such story, where the cost of love was measured, not in gold, but in courage. Part 1: The Sale in the Saloon. The year was 1872, and the sun went down over New Mexico like a coal easing into ash. By the time the last light bled off the mesa, the cross-eyed coyote had found its evening pulse lamps coughing with kerosene breath, a piano with teeth missing hunting for a tune, the floorboards warm with the day's heat and the day's sins. Men stood too deep at the bar, elbows shining, voices slurring into each other until words became weather. Cards slapped, dice ticked, and laughter rose with a brittle edge, the kind that breaks if you look it straight in the eye. The room smelled of old smoke, lamp oil, leather, wool damp with sweat, and a sweetness from the jars of peaches stacked behind Mac's counter, peaches no one ordered because the whiskey told simpler stories. The saloon kept its own time. The clock over the mirror had quit years ago, but every man in the room knew midnight when it walked in, the same way they knew trouble when it didn't bother to take off its hat. The batwing doors slapped open and took the conversation with them. A heavy-set man came in with the kind of swagger liquor lends to cowards, dragging behind him a girl with her wrists tied in rawhide. He wore dust like a badge and unpleasantness like a second coat. A week's beard tangled his jaw, and his eyes had the wet shine of someone who had argued with a bottle and lost. The girl's head was down, hair loose and dark, the swell of her belly making a truth of her in a way no one could ignore. Her dress was calico, washed to the color of old rain. She moved carefully, like a woman who knew the ground had plans for her, and she meant to change them if she could. The rawhide bit into the skin over her pulse, and the pulse kept talking anyway. The piano faltered, a note stuck in its throat. Mac wiped the same glass twice, and set it down like he'd thought of something better to do, and changed his mind. In the corner, 3 ranch hands stared the way. Men stare at a storm across the flats, part dread, part curiosity, part hunger they won't name aloud. "Business," the man announced, his grin showing too many teeth and too much gum. "I come on business." He pushed the girl forward until her knees kissed the plank. She didn't stumble. She absorbed the shove and straightened, breath steadying like a rider after a bad step. "Ain't livestock," the man added when someone near the stove muttered that this wasn't a stockyard. "She's my blood." The room winced. The word daughter moved through the air like a splinter, catching in throats. He lifted the girl's chin with 2 fingers. She flinched the way a burned hand flinches from a stove taut. Automatic, resolute. Her eyes were gray with dust and calculation, already measuring exits, already deciding how to look small until smallness quit being useful. "Name's Maria," the man said, as if names were property deeds. "But names are for people with futures. I'm taking bids. $2 and a jug." Laughter skittered around the room, too thin to stand up on its own. Someone called from the faro table, "Does she come with the problem, or is that extra?" Someone else asked about a warranty and a return policy. Jokes are a way to throw blankets over shame. The night had more blankets than beds. Mac polished the bar with a rag that had outlived 3 owners and most of their illusions. He didn't look at the girl. He looked at the mirror behind the bottles, where the coyote's yellow light made everyone kinder or crueler by a quarter inch. The mirror gave a warped version of the room back to itself, the men longer, the hats taller, the eyes smaller in the face. In the mirror, the man with the rawhide looked like a story that hadn't learned its lesson. In the mirror, the girl looked like a decision waiting to be made by someone else. She didn't speak. She counted the scratches in the plank beneath her feet, because counting is a way to keep from flying apart. She noted the placement of the stove, the angle of the back door that never latched right, the line of boots between her and the alley that smelled like onions and horse and relief. The child inside her rolled, a heel pressing insistently against her ribs, and she set her palm there the way a woman sets a hand on a gate to test if it will hold. The pressure steadied her. It reminded her of kitchens where beans simmered and sparrows hopped bold at the threshold, of a voice that had called her Nina before that word turned into a trap. She reached for that voice and found only the memory of someone turning away to lift a bottle. Her breath shortened, then lengthened, like a rope paying out and taking up again. He had been in the corner, a hat brim shading what the years had already carved. When the room turned toward the spectacle, he turned with it, not curious, so much as unwilling to let the night write another small cruelty in his ledger, without at least counting it. Tall and spare, coat brushed if not new, boots mended with care that reads as pride from a distance and thrift up close, Thomas Hale stepped forward enough to be seen. The piano player, drunk or maybe wise, let his hands fall into his lap. Dice held their breath mid-corner. Somewhere a chair squealed. Thomas set $2 silver on Mac's sticky wood with a click as clean as winter. "I ain't buying," he said, voice low and level. "I'm paying for quiet." The room made a sound like a dog being warned off a bone. The name Hale does that in certain towns brings up silhouettes of posters and stories about a man who outlived his luck, and a grave on a ridge whose grass never quite takes. The cellar Garrison, a name the coyote knew too well, squinted, as if the coins were a trick. He had once been good with a rope and a remuda, they said, before drink turned his days to the wrong kind of rounding up. Now his hands shook only when they weren't mean. "Quiet's dearer than $2. He snorted. "What do I get for the girl?" Thomas did not shift his weight. "You get to leave without a handprint on your face." Mac lifted the jug from beneath the plank with a put-upon sigh, held it where Garrison could see his future, and passed inside its clay belly. "Take your charity and go," Mac said, as if he were swatting a fly that had learned to talk. Garrison's jaw worked. He wanted to make a speech. Men who sell their souls always want a speech for the receipt. He settled for a glare and a reach. Coins vanished. Jug found a crook in his arm. The rawhide went slack. Thomas didn't touch the girl at first. He took the leather in his fingers the way a man takes a burr out of a horse's mane. Careful not to pull skin with it. Careful not to make the hurt worse by trying to help too sudden. "If you leave by the back," he said, eyes on the knot. "The alley's empty. I'll follow. Not close. If you run, I won't chase. If you fall, I'll carry." She watched his mouth as he spoke. The words were plain and poorly made for comfort, but they were not a trap. That was new. "Why?" she asked. Voice a rasp that wasn't quite permission. "Because someone should have," he said, and a nerve moved in his cheek. A long time ago, they stepped into the alley's narrow moon, and the smell of last night's onions. The batwings sighed back into place behind them, and the coyote let out its breath in laughter and lies. Maria moved quick enough to keep decisions ahead of her. Thomas kept back the distance a man keeps when he knows proximity can turn kindness into something unforgivable. The street ran like a river the town had learned to ford plank to plank, shadow to shadow, one false step from trouble either way. A lone lamp outside the blacksmith's made a stubborn circle of gold on the dust. The hotel's balcony creaked with the weight of sleep and secrets. Down by the hitching rail, a dun horse lifted its head to the sound of its name in a man's mouth without words. He showed her the stirrup and backed away, hands open as if the knight had to see he was unarmed. She mounted with care. A woman gives to the last object in the world that hasn't betrayed her. The saddle took her weight, with a groan that sounded like sympathy. 3 miles, Thomas said, taking the lead rope. Not the reins. Dust and a hill, and a trough with a little water, enough to argue with thirst. She made a sound that could have been agreement. The dun stepped forward, and the town stepped back, and the night widened. Behind them, Las Piedras gathered its courage, and its gossip at equal speed. Voices would be raised over breakfast. Hands waved, Grace said pointedly. But the road underfoot had no use for that. It took them the way roads take people who need taking evenly, and without questions, it is not paid to ask. Thomas walked like a man measuring penance with his stride. He kept his eyes on the ruts ahead, on rocks that would twist an ankle or a meaning. Twice he reached without looking when the dun tested the edge of the arroyo, his hand steadying what didn't strictly need, steadying and making the difference anyway. Maria watched the line of his back, the place where his coat had been sewn twice, once with clumsy thread, and again with the kind you use when you've learned better. She told herself to jump, to ride hard, and be done with him, with the town, with the rawhide still burning her wrists. But the jump didn't come. You can't jump with a child sitting under your heart. You can only choose a direction and refuse to stop. So she chose. Memory travels with less food than a mule, but leaves deeper ruts. Maria found an old kitchen on her tongue, the taste of calloused fingers tearing tortillas, smoke, lime, the salt of tears you pretend is from the dough. She remembered a small song her mother sang, before songs turned into broken plates, and the thud of fists on tables. She remembered the first time hope made a sound inside her like a bird under a blanket. That sound was quieter now, but it wasn't dead. She held her belly and promised the bird it would learn sky. The desert listened, as it always does, with the patience of stone. Thomas counted fence posts he'd driven in other years, other weathers. He put those numbers between himself and the temptation to say something large. Large promises are tyrants. They take what they want and leave a man poorer for having tried to feed them. He chose small things instead. The moment when a boot finds solid ground after a slide. The way a horse breathes, when it understands what you're asking, and agrees. The precise weight of $2 silver in a palm that has thrown away heavier coin and got nothing but trouble for it. He did not look back at the town. He had learned that looking back makes ghosts bold. The hill at the edge of Thomas's spread rose gradual then stubborn, the way pride does when you think you've convinced it to stay quiet. The wind softened as they climbed, picking at the sage just enough to make the air smell like clean regret. The moon took to watching from the ridgeline, a thin-lipped ant ready to judge but willing to keep a secret if asked nicely. Maria shifted and hissed between her teeth. "We can stop," Thomas said without turning. "No," she said, surprising herself with how much iron a word can hold when it has to. "If I stop now, I'll turn to salt." He nodded, and if he smiled, it didn't reach anyone but the ground at his feet. "Then we don't stop." They reached the trough, a long box of plank and stone, where a line of moonlight pooled. Not a spring, not a miracle, but water, the low kind that sits and asks you to come down to it. The dun nosed the surface, and lifted its head wet-lipped and satisfied. Maria slid down with the particular caution of a woman for whom falling has consequences beyond bruises. She knelt and cupped her hands and raised the desert's thin gift to her mouth. It tasted of iron and the stubbornness of men who dig where wiser men say don't. It tasted like the kind of mercy that never calls itself that. "What's your name?" she asked without looking up. "Thomas," he said. "Hale." She repeated it once, as if to see how it sat on her tongue. It fit there the way a nail fits a board, tight enough to hold, loose enough to pry out later if needed. They did not speak more. Some conversations do better without witnesses, and the night is a notorious eavesdropper. The dun flicked an ear, took one step back from the trough, and settled. Thomas leaned on the post with his forearms and stared at nothing until the shape of it agreed to change. Maria stood with her palm splayed over the slow wave of her belly, and looked at everything, because everything had tried to make a claim on her, and she was filing counterclaims of her own. Somewhere across the flats, a coyote made a joke only coyotes understand. The stars hammered themselves into the black. The town's last lamp gave up. Garrison found a corner and a jug, and the night did what nights do with men like him. It listened a little, then got bored, then moved on. "I'll stay till morning," Maria said at last. "Then I decide." "Morning's a good judge," Thomas answered. He gathered the lead rope and walked toward a house that did not yet know it would have to practice being a home. He didn't put a hand on her. He didn't need to. The road between the trough and the porch was short, but sometimes short roads are the longest because of what you agree to leave behind when you cross them. The porch step creaked like it had opinions. The door took a second to remember how to do its job, and then swung inward on hinges that had betrayed quieter arguments. Warmth staggered out to meet them, the memory of a day's sun caught in plank and nail. "There's space," Thomas said. And blankets. Tomorrow, if you walk, walk east. Less rock that way. Dawn would bring talking. It always did. The mercantile would measure out flour and the rumor of sin in equal scoops. The barber would nick a chin and swear it was because of the devil on the loose out north. Reverend Pike would stitch a sermon from old cloth and claim it fit. Martha Bryce would close her ledger hard enough to make dust jump and ride out later with advice that sounded like orders and love that looked like a frown. But all of that belonged to the hour when coffee cools and men decide who to be for the day. For now, the house settled a fraction on its foundation, as if making room for the new weight of two people learning where to put themselves in relation to each other and to the dark. Thomas banked the lamp and left it just shy of dying. He gestured to the smaller room. "Yours," he said. She stood at the threshold and studied the cot, the chest with its scar, the square of window that turned the moon into a coin. The knife on her hip felt both necessary and a little less lonely. "You'll take the chair by the stove?" she said. "I will. Don't try the door," she added, "because old habits are how a body stays in one piece." "I won't," he said, and he would not. She stepped inside and set her palm to the belly again. The child turned, calm now, as if approving the architecture of this pause. She lay down and faced the wall, and let her eyes practice closing. In the other room, Thomas sat with the guitar across his knees and touched the missing string gently, as if to apologize. He didn't play. He listened to the house breathe, and then he matched it. Not every story earns a drum roll. Some begin with a door that closes the right way and a lamp that chooses not to gutter. Some begin with water that is not a miracle but refuses to be nothing. Maria's last thought before sleep was not a prayer. It was a promise of inventory. In the morning, count spoons, count steps to the trough, count the boards that complain loudest, count the number of breaths it takes to forgive a stranger for being kind. Thomas's last thought before sleep was simpler. Keep watch until keeping watch becomes something more than habit. Outside, the night finished the small work it had left, cooling nails, settling dust, lifting the smell of onions out of the alley and carrying it toward the flats where such news is not considered news. Morning, when it came, would have its say. But between now and then lived a silence that did not demand payment, and two people who let it hold them without asking for change. Part 2. The Abandoned Ranch and the Dry Well. The trail wound on until night pressed close. The desert had a way of making distance heavy, each mile carrying more silence than the one before. By the time the dun horse dragged its hooves, and Thomas slowed his stride, Maria saw a shape waiting on the horizon. The ranch. It wasn't much. 3 rooms stitched together from clapboard and tin, leaning as though the wind had been nudging it for years. The barn sagged, the corral held only dust, and the fence posts stood like old men too stubborn to lie down. At the center of the yard was a well, its stones pale and cracked, its rope hanging limp over an empty mouth. Maria's heart sank. She had dreamed of escape, yes, but she had hoped escape would mean more than this skeleton of a place. Her voice slipped out bitter before she could stop it. "This your kingdom?" Thomas didn't bristle. He only rubbed the horse's neck, calm as if he'd heard harsher things before. Not a kingdom, just a roof. Inside, the house smelled of cedar smoke and long neglect. The table carried scars of knives, cups sat stacked like forgotten prayers, and the fireplace had ashes arranged by a man who still believed order might keep sorrow out. Against the wall leaned a guitar with one string missing, its wood worn smooth from hands that had once needed music. Maria let her eyes wander. She saw the chest in the small room, lid half open, fabric folded neat inside. She touched the corner of a baby's dress, hand-sewn, too small for any child who had lived long. She shut the chest quickly, as though she had intruded on something sacred. Thomas set a lamp down, the flame steady but low. "This room's yours. Cot, blanket, door. Tomorrow you decide if you stay." Her eyes narrowed. "And tonight? I'll take the chair by the stove." The words hung between them like a truce signed in dust. That night, Maria lay awake on the cot, hand tight around the knife she had hidden in her skirt since town. Every creak of the house pulled her thoughts taut. She listened for his footsteps, for the scrape of a door, for the proof that men are always the same. But none came, only the faint sound of strings being touched. Thomas with the guitar, plucking what notes remained, music broken but careful. She stared at the ceiling until her eyes stung. The baby shifted, and she whispered to it, "Not much longer, little one. We keep moving, always moving." In the other room, Thomas sat in the glow of the fire, guitar across his knees. His fingers stumbled where a string was gone, and the melody fell apart. He let it fade, staring at the wood as though the instrument might speak for those he'd lost. Then he leaned back, closed his eyes, and told himself what he told himself every night. One more sunrise, just one more, and outside, the dry well waited. Waiting not just for rain, but for someone stubborn enough to believe it could still give. Part 3. Wind and What the Town Said. Morning came thin and hard, like light squeezed through a keyhole. Maria woke to the brittle chatter of sparrows nesting in the porch eaves, and the ache of a night spent holding her breath. The dun horse blew at the fence. Somewhere behind the house, a pump handle squealed and then knocked as Thomas coaxed a stingy ribbon of water from the ground pipe he'd sunk into the arroyo last winter. Not a well, just a stubborn idea with rust on it. He left a tin cup and a heel of bread on the table, then stepped outside to mend the south fence. Maria ate standing up, as if the floor might move, and studied the house in daylight. It wore its history in the open knife marks in the table edge, a nail in the doorframe with a faded scrap of ribbon still tied there, the guitar by the wall, unstrung along one side like a mouth missing words. By noon the wind picked up and carried town with it news, guesses, and that brand of righteousness that smells like kerosene. Folks from Las Piedras always said the same two things about the desert. It was honest, and it was cruel. They never noticed how often they were talking about themselves. The first visitor was the kind the wind blows in when it wants mischief to sit a spell. A rider in a prayer black coat, collar tight as a judgment. Reverend Pike. He set his horse at the fence and regarded the place with a missionary's disapproval, the sort that mistakes quiet for sin. Thomas kept working the fence post, tamping earth with the flat of a shovel. "Morning, Reverend." "Mornin', Mr. Hale." Pike's gaze slid past him to the porch, where Maria stood with one hand braced against the doorframe. "You got yourself company." Thomas didn't turn. "She's none of your business." "Ain't souls my business?" Pike smiled the way men smile before they light a fuse. "Town's worried." "One. Town should plant beans," Thomas said. Pike's hand smoothed his coat front. "There's talk she's heavy with trouble, not just child. That she's from across," he gestured vaguely south, "and you always did have a taste for trouble that came on a horse with no saddle." Thomas drove the shovel down once, twice, like punctuation. "You preaching or gossiping, Reverend?" "Sometimes they share a pulpit." Pike tugged his reins. "Sunday I'll let the good book speak on it. Best you bring the woman so folks can watch the Lord do his sorting." Maria felt the heat rise in her cheeks. Anger has a fever all its own. She stepped forward before Thomas could answer. "I don't ask your book nothing," she said. "And I don't sit for your sorting." Pike's eyes flicked to her belly and back. "Pride goeth before the fall, miss. When he did our grast, with the ard by at a dost. Falls come whether a woman's proud or not." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The Reverend clicked his tongue. "She's got fire, Thomas. Be sure you don't get burned." He turned the horse and rode out as if he'd done a holy deed, dust lifting behind him like a veil. Thomas didn't speak for a time. He pressed the dirt tight, set the shovel aside, and wiped his palms on his trousers. "Town's going to choose a story," he said at last. "They like the kind that fits in a hymn. They'll hum it till it sounds true." "What story did they choose for you?" Maria asked. "The short one." He picked up the coil of wire and started along the fence line. Short stories are easier to carry when a man needs a rock to throw. The day settled into work. Maria found a broom and made the floorboards remember they had a color. She beat dust from curtains and discovered they'd once been white. She opened the chest in the small room and lifted the top tray. Inside was a baby dress, plain and hand-stitched, folded so carefully that touching it felt like trespass. She set it down like you set down a name you don't get to speak. On the second afternoon, another rider came, a woman this time, bonnet askew, jaw set iron, Martha Bryce from the feed store. She didn't bother tying off, just swung down and marched up the steps, like the porch was a courtroom and she'd been elected judge by a jury of her temper. "You," she said to Maria. "You the girl from Garrison's house?" Maria's throat tightened on the word house. "I'm Maria Delgado," she said. Martha's eyes did a quick tally: dress, hands, belly, the knife callus that prints itself on a woman's finger when she's had to cut more than bread. "You've got nerve, I'll allow." She looked past Maria to the guitar. So did the last woman here. It didn't save her. Save her from what? From everything. Martha shifted, the leather of her gloves creaking in a way that sounded like worry. "Thomas Hale is a canyon with a floor at the bottom and a sky at the top and no stairs. Good man to have when wolves come. Hard man to live beside when they don't. You think you're the only thing he's trying to keep alive? You're wrong. He's keeping his ghosts fed too." Thomas stepped out then, wiping his hands on a rag. "Afternoon, Martha. Don't afternoon me." She shook her head. "You could have taken that girl to the Whitakers. They keep strays." "She ain't a stray," Thomas said. "No," Martha replied. "She's a storm." She cut her eyes back to Maria. "You sure you want to be where lightning has a habit of finding?" Maria lifted her chin. "Lightning finds me where I stand. Might as well stand where there's a roof." For a heartbeat Martha looked like she might smile. She didn't. "Town won't bring you sugar," she said. "But it'll bring you opinion. This is mine. Don't let that well decide who you are. Men die when water leaves them. Women don't have time." She stepped down, swung into the saddle. "You need anything that ain't a sermon, you ask at my store." She spurred off, the horse's hooves biting small truths from the road. That evening the wind changed direction and came cold from the mountains. Thomas brought in kindling and set a fire so modest it felt like good manners. Maria cleaned the table and found 2 bowls whose cracks had been mended with wire and tin. She cooked beans and rabbit like a woman who has boiled hope before and knows the timing. When they ate, it was quiet at first, then less so. "Who played?" she asked, nodding at the guitar. "My wife," he said. "What happened to her?" "Life," he said, and the word wore all its letters like stitches. He added, "softer," and "fever." She kept her eyes on the steam. "The dress in the chest belonged to a girl who didn't make it to her name," he said. His spoon paused midway. "Some stories don't have words. They just have places where the words could have gone." The room listened to its own breathing a while. Maria set her spoon down with care. "In Las Piedras they'll say, 'I'm yours,'" she said. "They'll say the child is too." "Town's mouth is a river," Thomas said. "We don't drink from it." She watched the fire flatten and bloom. "What do you drink from, then?" He looked toward the door, toward the yard, toward the blank sky where stars would come if patient. "Mornings," he said. "The way it feels to swing your feet to the floor and choose to stand. The sound a fence post makes when it sets right. A horse that decides not to run. A woman who calls her own name. This one's out of that stad." She thought of the Reverend and the feed store woman, and the dress in the chest, and her mother's hand pushing her toward a door anyone could walk through but no one should. "I call my name," she said. "Good," he answered. And it was. Word travels on feet, but it also travels on eyes. Before the week was through, Las Piedras had its tune. They sang it at the mercantile with sugar weighed wrong, and at the barber's with scissors held high like witnesses. They sang it, while sweeping stoops and milking goats, and counting coins. The verse went that Thomas Hale, sinner of old stories, had taken in a Mexican girl heavy with sin of her own. And wasn't it a perfect thing the devil makes partners of his favorites? They didn't sing the bridge, the part where a woman chosen by no one chooses to live anyway. Songs in town don't often learn new chords. One evening, Maria woke from a nap, with the raw taste of iron in her mouth, the taste of a memory that runs to catch up. She stepped out for air, and caught sight of Thomas crossing the back pasture, walking toward the low rise behind the barn. He carried nothing. A man with a chore looks different than a man with a burden. She followed at a distance, feet quiet in the dust. The rise wasn't much, just enough to put a man a head higher than his choices. The wind came cleaner up there. It lifted the grass in a tired kind of wave and combed the split cedar posts. Maria stopped when she saw them. 3 markers, simple crosses cut from fence slats, set in a row like thoughts a man never finished. The first leaned left, the second right, the third stood stubborn and straight. No names. Just dates carved with a knife and the marks of a hand that had done the same hurt more than once. Thomas stood with his hat in his fist. He didn't pray the sound of it would have rung wrong in him. He just stood the way a tree stands when lightning's already introduced itself and there's no point pretending. After a long while he spoke, and the wind carried it back to Maria, as if it had decided to be kind for once. "I can't bring any of you water," he said. "But I can bring her." Maria stepped away then, giving him his ghosts. She walked down the slope and across the yard and past the dry well, its stones warm from the day, and thought about how men bury things out where the sky can see, and women bury them closer in. She put her hand on the well's lip, and felt its cool heart deep in the rock waiting not dead. "You hear me?" she whispered to the dark. "I ain't asking. I'm telling. When it's time, you give." That night the wind shifted again, and brought the desert's quiet the way a mother brings a sleeping child, careful, with her breath held. Maria lay awake, listening to the house settle, and the distant yap of coyotes, and the small sound Thomas made when a dream let go of him too fast. She thought of leaving at first light like she'd said. She thought of the Reverend's eyes and Martha's gloves and the cross without names and the guitar missing one string. She thought of the baby's heel pressing her from the inside, as if knocking, as if asking whether this could be a door instead of a wall. In the dark, choices line up and look taller than they are. Maria rolled to her side and watched the thin flame on the stove blink like it was learning to say yes. She let the thought settle that she would stay one more dawn. Just one. Then she fell asleep without permission and dreamed of rain walking up the arroyo on bare feet. Morning found her on the porch with a needle and the blue ribbon from the doorframe, stitching a new string onto the old guitar. She worked slow, hands remembering lessons poverty gives, how to bind what splits, how to coax use from what's given up. Thomas stepped out, stopped short, and looked at her hands, then at the instrument. "It won't tune right," he said quietly. "Doesn't need to," she answered. "It needs to remember how to sound." He sat on the step below hers and took the guitar when she offered it. He turned the pegs till the pitch found something close to true, and then he played a chord so small it didn't even cross the yard. Another chord, and a third. The music sat between them like a dog that's been beat before deciding to trust again. "You gonna take me to church Sunday?" Maria asked after a while, tone dry. Thomas's mouth tilted. "We'll be in the pasture," he said. "Fence is preaching to me." "Good," she said. "I don't like Pike's hymns." "Me neither." The afternoon heat rose and banked itself against the hills. Clouds stacked to the west, purple-bellied and slow summer's old grudge gathering itself. The smell came first, the way rain sends a letter ahead. Damp metal, creosote waking, earth remembering. Maria stood and braced a hand to her lower back, and the baby rolled like a small wave beneath her palm. "Feels like a storm," she said. Thomas shaded his eyes and looked toward the mountains. "Not rain," he said. "Wind with teeth. We'll need to cover the windows and lay wet cloth by the door." He paused, listening to the ground. "Stay near the cellar stairs if it looks bad." Maria nodded. She had lived through men who blew in like weather and left wreckage that took seasons to sweep. She had learned to read the pressure drop, the taste that comes on your tongue an hour before the world tries to roll you under. She looked at the sky and at the dry well and at the house that might become a home if the hinges didn't give, and the roof held, and the two people under it decided they could stand each other's quiet. She looked at Thomas, who was watching the horizon like a man who expects trouble because today isn't special, it's just next. "Let it come," she murmured to the child. "We'll stand up to it together." Part 4. The Sandstorm and the Child. By mid-afternoon, the light went the color of old copper. Out past the corral, the horizon drew its shoulders up as if preparing to charge, and a low sound rolled across the flats, not thunder, not yet, but the voice a desert uses when it's about to pick a fight. Maria stood on the porch with one hand in the small of her back and the other braced to the doorframe, feeling the baby shift like a boat in shallow water. Thomas moved quick and spare, the way a man does when he's already made up his mind. He hauled damp burlap from the wash barrel and hammered it over window cracks, wedged cloth beneath the door, latched the barn, checked the cellar latch twice. The dun horse skirted the fence, eyes white, blowing a question that had only one answer. Hold. Sand with claws, Thomas said when he came back inside, breath thin. We ride it out below ground. His gaze flicked to her belly, then to her face. You steady? As steady as a woman carrying a storm, she said. She meant the sky and she meant the child, and he knew it. The first gust struck like a thrown fist. The house leaned and creaked and then gritted its teeth. Dust threaded the room through seams too small to see. The lamps burned mean and low. Thomas crossed the floor in 3 strides, took her elbow, and eased her toward the trapdoor near the stove. Cellar, he said. I can walk, she answered, and did, though her breath shortened, and her jaw set hard enough to hurt. The trap lifted with a groan, the cool breath of earth rising to meet the hot breath of wind. Thomas set the lantern down the steps first, then one palm to the beam, the other open for her balance. They went below as the second gust hit. Stronger, meaner, sand needled the shutters and made a swarm's thin whine around the eaves. The cellar wasn't much, stone walls sweating damp, shelves with jars empty as the well, a cot folded against the far wall, a barrel half full of rainwater saved from a kinder season. Thomas had cleared it once for a fever that didn't break. After that, he left it tidy out of respect for what it had taken. Maria reached the packed dirt floor and stopped like a tree stops root first. A pain cinched her middle like a rope pulled by a man who didn't know when to quit. She bent, both hands to the table edge, breath sheared short. Her knife clattered from somewhere in her skirt and skittered to a stop beneath the cot. Neither of them went after it. Now? Thomas asked, and the one syllable had years in it. She nodded, eyes shut, sweat starting at her hairline. Now. Another blow shook the house above them. The lantern flame leaned, caught itself, held. Thomas dragged the cot out, threw blankets, rolled another into a bolster. Water, he said to himself, and dipped a rag, wrung it, laid it across her shoulders. He washed his hands as he'd watched a midwife do once in a room where the air smelled like boiled linen and fear, and he said a word he rarely said because it never sounded right in his mouth. Please. Maria's body took over the way seas take over coasts. The storm outside made a racket of nails and dust and rage. But the storm inside her was quieter and more terrible, a rhythm older than men and their judgments. She wrote it with her teeth, with her hands fisted in wool, with the low sound a woman makes when the world asks more than it has any right to ask. Between the waves she remembered other rooms, a feed store with cracked windows, a father's hand closing around her wrist like a shackle, the saloon's stale air, the rawhide whispering as it fell, the way Thomas had stood as if danger could not find purchase on him if he refused it a grip. She remembered the well's stone lip cool beneath her fingers. You hear me? She had told the dark. I ain't asking, I'm telling. She said it again now, because bargains made with the ground are the only ones that hold. You hear me, she sobbed through her teeth. You give. Thomas knelt by the cot and let her crush his hand. The bones shifted, and he did not pull away. He counted her breaths when counting helped, fell silent when silence did. Once she looked at him with a kind of fury that wasn't for him but needed a face. He gave her his. Push when your body says push, he said. Rest when it says rest. He wiped her forehead and felt old rooms around them, rooms he could not fix, nights he could not unspend. In each of those rooms a breath had gone missing and never come back. He had dug with his hands until the dirt filled all his knuckles, and nothing grew where he planted. He had told himself a well can run dry for good. He had chosen to believe it because believing otherwise cost too much. Above, something tore loose and crossed the roof with a wild clatter. The cellar door thumped, the latch bit down, sand hissed at the seams. The lantern guttered again and steadied, throwing their shadows large against the stone, like two strangers arguing about fate. Another pain rose up and broke over Maria like heat over rails. She bore down and the world narrowed to breath and blood and will. Thomas said her name because names are ropes thrown across water. Maria. She shook her head, gave a rough sound that was not consent and not refusal but endurance. He said it again, steadier. Maria, you're here, stay with me. I am, she said, and she was. The contraction let her loose just long enough for a memory to walk in Martha Bryce on the porch. Jaw set, warning laid like a plank. Don't let that well decide who you are. Women don't have time. Maria laughed a broken edge of a laugh. Part pain, part promise. I'm deciding, she whispered. Right now. The next wave came and she met it standing in her mind, if not on her feet like someone who has been moved too many times without being asked. Thomas felt the strength run through her and into his wrist, and up his arm and into his chest like a salvage crew finding a beam that will still bear weight. Good, he said roughly. Good. Time changed shape. It stopped being minutes and became moments. The rag cooling and warming and cooling again. The lantern popping once. The cellar shaking with a gust so hard the walls answered back. Maria finding a rhythm and keeping it. Thomas hearing a voice that wasn't the wind and wasn't memory, and might have been his own courage coming home. Then there it was. The change that people who have watched enough births recognize without needing words, a turning, an opening. The breath everyone holds because they have all felt the cliff they cannot see. Maria cried out. Not a plea but a command. And Thomas moved his hands without thinking, and with absolute care. Now, he told her. And she did. And the world tipped. For a heartbeat, the two storms, sky and body, balanced on the lip of a silence so complete even the wind listened. Then a sound rose, thin and fierce, full of life's refusal to apologize. A baby's cry, blade sharp, bell bright, cutting through dust and fear and years. It echoed off stone and off the roofline and off the parts of Thomas that had been empty so long he had forgotten their names. He laughed once in shock, and then made a sound he hadn't made since the ridge. Something like a sob and something like a prayer. He lifted the small, wet, furious thing, wrapped her tight, and set her into Maria's waiting arms as if he were returning a crown to its rightful owner. The lantern light found the curve of the child's cheek, the small root of her nose, the fists that understood fighting before they understood anything else. Maria folded around her daughter with a tenderness that had teeth. She kissed the damp hair. Hope, she said, voice sand raw and certain. Your name is Hope. Outside, the wind struck the house again, but it sounded farther off, already regretting its temper. Dust still hissed. The rafters still complained. Somewhere the dun horse stamped and shook its halter and then stilled. In the cellar, the new sound persisted, insistent as a creak in spring. Thomas sat back on his heels, both hands open in his lap like a man showing he's got no weapon left and no need of one. He looked at Maria, her face pale with work, eyes burning like coals that had decided to be fire again, and then at the child. You saved her, he said, and it wasn't a question. Maria's mouth bent in a tired smile that knew too much. She saved me, she answered. We all did. The lantern flickered, steadied. A draft found the back of Thomas's neck and made him look up toward the ceiling, as if he could see through wood and dust to whatever sky was left. For a breath he thought he heard water. No, only wind changing keys. He shook his head once, as if to clear the sort of hope that hurts when it dies. Still, he stood and stoked the flame and checked the latch, and draped another wet cloth across the sill. Sleep, he told Maria, knowing she couldn't, knowing she would try for the child's sake. He fetched the little blue ribbon she'd used to restring the guitar, and placed it on the crate beside the cot. For later, he said, when she needs tying into the world. Maria breathed deep, full as a belly will allow, and closed her eyes. The child settled. The house above them creaked as the storm moved off to bother another piece of earth. Thomas sank onto the cellar step, elbows to knees, head bowed. The old ache pressed against his ribs the way sorrow does when it's trying to make room for something that might be joy. He spoke to the floor because the floor had never lied to him. If you're listening, he said, to the ground, to the ridge, to the crosses without names, we did it. She did it. He rubbed a palm over his face and felt grit and salt, dust and water. "Hold us a while." The wind took a long, slow breath and let it out. In that pause, the desert remembered how to be quiet without being cruel. The lantern's flame, having survived the worst of it, burned small and stubborn and sure, and in a cellar built to store potatoes and sorrow, a child named for what people lose too often and find too late, sang her first song against the dark. Thomas listened, until listening became the only thing he wanted to do. When his eyes finally closed, it was not because he trusted the night, but because for once the night seemed to trust them back. Part 5. The Well and the Dawn of Hope. The storm broke in the night, leaving silence that felt borrowed. When Thomas pushed the cellar door open, the morning met him with a sky washed pale and clean, like the desert had burned through one skin and put on another. He climbed out slow, boots sinking in the drifted sand, every step an argument with exhaustion. For a long while he only stood, breathing the kind of air a man learns not to expect. Then he saw it. The well. He crossed the yard like a man walking toward a ghost he isn't sure he wants to touch. Yesterday, that circle of stone had been nothing but an empty throat, years of drought echoing down its gullet, but now moonlight pooled at the bottom. Water. Thin, silver, real. The rope hung heavy when he pulled it, and when the bucket rose it sloshed against his wrist, cool and impossible. He laughed once, a sound that startled even him, then pressed his face to his sleeve and stood still, letting it sink in. The desert had listened, or maybe it had grown tired of saying no. Behind him the cellar creaked. Maria stepped into the light, her daughter bound close to her chest, her face pale with the work of the night but eyes sharp as ever. She saw the bucket, saw the way Thomas's hand trembled on the rope, and her breath caught. "Is it real?" she asked. He turned, water dripping down his forearm, and held it out to her. "Taste." Maria dipped her fingers, touched them to Hope's lips. The baby stirred, swallowed, and let out a soft sound that belonged more to dawn than to storm. Tears filled Maria's eyes, though her voice held steady. "It's real." She sat on the low stone lip of the well, rocking her child, whispering words only a mother and the wind can share. Thomas lowered himself across from her, knees creaking, hat in his hands. For a long while neither spoke. The desert spoke enough. A hush after rage, the scent of wet earth rising rare as prayer. At last Thomas found words. "I buried too many. Thought the ground was done with me. Thought water was something a man only dreamed of when he was dying." He shook his head, eyes on the child. "Maybe I was wrong." Maria met his gaze. "The ground gives when someone refuses to stop asking. So does the sky." She pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead. "Her name is Hope." Thomas repeated it, as if saying it aloud would carve it into the day. Hope. The name fit in his chest, where grief had made its camp. They sat there until the sun climbed high enough to burn the sand white again. Hope slept. Maria dozed, head resting against the well. Thomas watched the horizon, watched the desert that had tried to break him, and felt, for the first time in years, that maybe he could stand to be part of something larger than survival. The desert had taken much, it always would. But on that morning, by a well that had given water again, two broken lives found a beginning instead of an ending. If this story left a mark upon your heart, then you know you belong here. In the wild and restless heart of the American West, nothing comes easy, least of all love. Yet every hardship carries its own kind of grace, and every scar tells of something worth keeping. Subscribe, and ride with me again into the next story, carried by dust, fire, and the endless wind.